I came home early that Tuesday afternoon because my back had been playing up and I'd left my medication on the kitchen bench. 38 years of marriage, and I still hadn't learned to check my pockets before walking out the door. That small act of forgetfulness, that one ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday, changed everything. My name is Graham Whitfield. I'm 64 years old, retired electrical engineer. Live in a weatherboard house on the outskirts of Ballarat, Victoria. I've got a veggie patch out the back that my wife Diane always said was more trouble than it was worth. I've got a border collie named Biscuit who still thinks he's a puppy. And until that afternoon, I thought I had a marriage that was, if not perfect, then solid. Built on decades of shared dinners and mortgage payments and hospital waiting rooms and the kind of quiet companionship that people stop noticing because it's always just been there. I pulled into the driveway at 1:30. Diane's car was there, which wasn't unusual. She worked part-time at a community health clinic and had Tuesdays off. What was unusual was the second car parked behind hers, half hidden beside the fence, a silver Mazda. I knew that car. I'd helped pay for it, actually, when the previous owner had left the young couple short one Christmas a few years back. It belonged to my son-in-law, Marcus. My daughter, Claire, drove a white Subaru. Marcus had the silver Mazda. Claire would have been at work. She ran the front desk at a dental practice in the city and didn't finish until 6. So why was Marcus here? I sat in my ute for a moment. My back was throbbing. I told myself there were a dozen innocent explanations. Maybe he'd come to fix something. He was handy enough with tools. Maybe Diane had asked him to look at the guttering again. Maybe he was just dropping something off. I let myself in through the side gate, the way I always did when I came home through the garden. Biscuit was in his kennel out back, which was strange. Diane usually let him inside when she was home. He looked at me with those amber eyes, and I put my finger to my lips without really knowing why. The back door was unlocked. I stepped into the laundry, then through to the kitchen. I could hear music coming from somewhere down the hall. Not loud, just a low hum of something soft and ambient. The kind of music Diane used to say helped her relax. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment. I didn't move toward the hallway. I didn't call out. Something heavy and cold was settling in my chest, and some part of me, some part I hadn't known existed until that moment, already knew. I walked back outside without making a sound. I sat in my ute for another 10 minutes. Then I drove to the chemist, picked up my medication, went to a cafe on Sturt Street, ordered a flat white I barely touched, and tried to think clearly. By the time I got home that evening, Marcus's car was gone. Diane was in the kitchen making pasta. She asked how my back was. I said better. We ate dinner in front of the television, the way we'd been doing for years, and I watched her out of the corner of my eye and tried to find something in her face that would tell me I was wrong, that I'd imagined it, that the music had been the radio, that Marcus had been fixing the guttering, that my brain had constructed a story from nothing because sometimes lonely retired men do that. But I'd seen the way Biscuit was shut outside. Diane only ever did that when she didn't want him getting underfoot indoors, when she wanted the house to herself. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside her and listened to her breathing and thought about 38 years. Thought about Claire, our only daughter, who had been with Marcus for 9 years and married him 4 years ago in a garden ceremony at a winery in the Yarra Valley. I'd walked her down the aisle. I'd made a speech. I'd told Marcus to his face that I was glad to have him as a son. I thought about what it would mean to be wrong. I thought about what it would mean to be right. By morning, I decided I needed to know for certain before I did anything at all. I wasn't impulsive about it. That's not my nature. I'd spent 40 years as an engineer. You learn to gather data before you draw conclusions. You learn that the cost of acting on incomplete information is almost always higher than the cost of waiting. So I waited. I watched. I started coming home at different times, taking different routes, parking down the street, and walking the last block. I paid attention to when Diane said she'd be home and when she actually was. I noticed small things: a car shifted in the driveway when no one had mentioned going out, towels in the laundry that didn't match our usual routine, Diane's phone face down on the table when it used to always face up. After 2 weeks, I had enough. I'd bought a small recording device, the kind you can get at any electronics shop, no bigger than a USB drive. I placed it in the hallway on a Tuesday morning before I left, tucked behind a framed photo of Claire's wedding that sat on the hall table. I drove away. I stayed away until 4 o'clock. When I played back the recording that night, sitting alone in the garden shed with Biscuit at my feet, I heard everything I'd been dreading. Voices. Both of them. Clearly. Laughter. Early on. Then quiet. Then, eventually, movement in the hallway. The sound of the back door. Marcus's car starting and pulling away. I sat with that for a long time. I want to say I felt devastated. I did. Eventually. But the first thing I felt, the very first thing, sitting in that shed with the small device in my hand and Biscuit pressing his warm weight against my leg, was a strange, clarifying calm. Like something I'd suspected for a long time had finally been confirmed, and now I could stop pretending otherwise. The second thing I felt was anger. Not hot anger. Cold anger. The kind that doesn't shout or throw things. The kind that makes plans. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I'm not entirely proud of it, and I'm not entirely ashamed of it either. I think most people, if they're truthful with themselves, would understand. I didn't confront Diane. Not yet. I didn't call Claire. I didn't speak to Marcus. Instead, I spent the next few days thinking carefully about what I had, what I needed, and what I wanted the outcome to be. What I had. A recording. Clear voices. Enough to be certain, but perhaps not enough to be legally airtight in every scenario. I knew I needed more documentation, dates, a clear financial picture of what was mine and what was ours. I rang an old colleague, a man named Desmond Hartley, who'd retired from engineering a few years before me, but had always had a sharper head for legal matters than I did. He'd been through his own divorce a decade earlier, and had come out of it wiser than most. Over coffee at his place in Sebastopol, I explained what I knew and what I suspected. He didn't say much. He listened, nodded a few times, then said, "Graham, before you do anything else, you need to sit down with a solicitor, not a family friend, not someone who knows Diane, a proper family law solicitor. And you need to do it before she knows you know anything." I asked him why that mattered. Why the timing? He looked at me steadily. Because once she knows you know, decisions get made fast. Accounts get shuffled. Assets get complicated. You want to understand your position while everything is still exactly where it's always been. I took his advice. 2 days later, I was sitting across from a solicitor named Anne Castellan at a firm in Ballarat's CBD. She was in her 50s, precise and unhurried, and she listened to everything I told her without a flicker of surprise. I got the feeling she'd heard variations of this story more times than she could count. She asked me about our assets, the house, the investment property we owned in Geelong, superannuation, savings, shares. She asked me about anything I'd inherited or brought into the marriage. She explained what the Family Law Act said about the division of property, what a clean break might look like, what the likely range of outcomes was. Then she said something that lodged itself firmly in my mind. Don't do anything that could be characterized as harassment, stalking, or revenge. Courts don't look kindly on it, and it shifts the focus from their conduct to yours. I nodded. I understood. I thanked her and made another appointment for the following week. On the way out, I asked her first name again. She said Anne. I thanked her, and I thought, good. Not Patricia. Not any of the names that turn up in stories like this as if they're assigned at random from a short list. I went home. I made tea. I sat in the garden and looked at my vegetable beds and thought about what I was going to do. Here is what I didn't do. I didn't tamper with anything. I didn't move money. I didn't start arguments designed to generate evidence. I'd thought about various small retaliations, nothing dangerous, nothing that would hurt anyone physically, just things that might make a point. I thought about them, and I put them aside. Anne Castellan's voice was in my head, and beneath that, something older, the knowledge that what I did now was who I was going to be for the rest of my life. I was 64 years old. I wasn't going to become someone I didn't recognize. What I did do was this. I started quietly documenting everything. Dates, times, the recording. I made a list of every significant asset I could identify. I had a financial advisor appointment I'd been meaning to book for months. I booked it. I reviewed our joint accounts. I looked carefully at what had been happening in the investment account Diane nominally managed. What I found there wasn't alarming, exactly. But there were transfers I didn't remember authorizing, regular amounts going somewhere I didn't recognize. I noted it all. I forwarded it all to Anne Castellan's office, and then I waited for the right moment. It came not from me, but from Claire. She rang on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after that first Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen doing the washing up. Her voice was strange, tight, and careful in the way it gets when she's trying to control something. She said she needed to ask me something, and she needed me to be honest with her. I dried my hands on the tea towel and walked out to the garden. "Go ahead," I said. She said she'd found something in Marcus's phone. She didn't say what exactly, I think. She couldn't bring herself to describe it in detail, but she'd found it. And she'd sat with it for 2 days by herself. And now she was ringing me because she didn't know what to do, and I was the only person she trusted to tell her the truth. I stood there in the garden in the fading Sunday light with biscuit circling my feet. I thought about what Anne Castellan had said about not doing anything that couldn't be walked back. I thought about my daughter's voice on the phone, tight and scared. And I thought about all the things a parent wants to protect a child from, even when that child is 32 years old and married and living in a house in Fitzroy. I said, "Claire, I think you should come to Ballarat. I think we need to sit down together." She came the next morning. She arrived looking like she hadn't slept. I made eggs and toast, neither of us ate, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her what I knew. I showed her the dates. I played her a portion of the recording, just enough, not all of it. Because some things a daughter doesn't need to hear in detail. She didn't cry immediately. She went very still and quiet in the way she'd done since she was small, when something was too large to process. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her. 5 weeks. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said I wanted to be certain first. I said I wanted to have my own situation clear before I brought it to her doorstep. I said I was sorry. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mum's at home right now." I said yes. She said, "I need to talk to her." I said I'd leave them to it and take Biscuit for a walk. What happened in that kitchen while I was walking around Lake Wendore for an hour, I only know from what Claire told me later. She said Diane had initially tried to minimize it, said it wasn't what it seemed, said it had only happened a handful of times, said it was over. Claire said she'd sat there and listened and felt something she described as a kind of cold comprehension, like watching a building you'd always trusted slowly show you its cracks. When I came back, Diane was in the bedroom with the door closed. Claire was at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of cold tea. She looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I sat down across from her. I said she had nothing to apologize for. She said, "I had no idea. I want you to know that. I know that doesn't help, but I had no idea." I told her I believed her. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "What do you want to do now?" Not, "What are you going to do?" Not, "What should we do?" She asked what I wanted. At 64, after nearly 4 decades of making decisions with someone else at the table, there's something quietly powerful about being asked that question in that particular way. I told her what I wanted. I wanted to be honest. I wanted to be fair. And I wanted to move forward. Diane and I talked that evening, the first real conversation we'd had in years, if I'm honest, the first one that didn't run along the comfortable grooves of routine. She cried. I didn't, not then. She said she was sorry. I told her I believed her. I also told her what I'd done over the past 5 weeks. The solicitor, the documentation, the financial review. I didn't say it unkindly. I said it matter-of-factly. The way you state the terms of a situation that's already been decided. She went quiet when I mentioned the investment account transfers. She said she could explain them. I said she'd have the opportunity to do that through proper channels. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Is there anything I can do?" I said I thought we'd moved beyond that. I moved into the spare room that night. I rang Ann Castellan the next morning. The months that followed were not easy. I won't pretend they were. Divorce, even when it's the right decision, is a kind of slow demolition. There are papers and meetings and valuations and negotiations that require you to sit across a table from someone you once loved and reduce 38 years to a series of figures and percentages. There are nights when the house is very quiet and the bed feels wrong and Biscuit keeps going to the door of the room you no longer sleep in. The investment account became a significant point of negotiation. Ann Castellan's team had traced the transfers and established a clear picture. Diane's solicitor, to his credit, didn't fight it strenuously. The documentation was thorough enough that prolonged resistance would have cost more than it saved. A settlement was reached after 4 months. The house would be sold and proceeds divided, with a weighting in my favor given the financial irregularities. The Geelong property I received outright. It had been purchased in part with money from my father's estate, and Anne had argued successfully for that. Superannuation was split, according to formula. I wasn't made whole. No settlement ever makes you whole. But I was, as Desmond had put it when I rang him with the news, in a solid position. Not gutted. Not starting from nothing at 64. Marcus and Claire separated within the same month. Claire told me she'd had a conversation with Marcus that had lasted 5 hours and hadn't resolved anything, and after that, she'd just known. She'd moved her things out of the Fitzroy house and into a friend's place in Thornbury, and then, 2 months later, she'd rung and asked if she could come back to Ballarat for a while, just to get her feet under her. I said of course. She moved into the spare room, my spare room now, in the house I was renting in a quiet street on the other side of Ballarat, while the original house went through the sale process. She brought her plants and her good coffee machine and her habit of listening to podcasts while she cooked, and for a while the house was filled with more noise and life than I'd expected. We fell into a routine. She cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I cooked the rest of the week. We watched the football on weekends. She'd never really liked football, but she watched it with me anyway, the way she'd done when she was a teenager, asking questions I never tired of answering. We talked, in the evenings, in ways we hadn't talked in years. About her marriage, about mine, about what we'd both missed and why, about what we both wanted from the years ahead. I don't think either of us had anticipated that the worst thing that had ever happened to our family would also be the thing that brought us back to each other properly. I'm not glad it happened, I want to be clear about that. I'm not one of those people who says everything happens for a reason, because I don't believe it does. Some things are just damage. But sometimes, out of damage, something honest grows. I started going to a men's well-being group that met on Wednesday evenings at a community center in town. A mate of Desmond's had mentioned it, just a few blokes of similar vintage, sitting around talking about life, after the things you didn't plan for. I'd been skeptical. I'm not naturally someone who talks in groups, but I went once and then kept going, and I found To my surprise, that I wasn't unusual, that there were other men my age navigating the same terrain, the silence, the recalibration, the strange mix of grief and relief. The house sold in November. The settlement completed shortly after. I found a place to buy a smaller weatherboard on the eastern edge of Ballarat, with a big backyard. The first thing I did was dig a new vegetable bed. Claire moved into a flat in Brunswick at the start of the following year, closer to work. She texted me photos of it when she moved in small, bright rooms. Her plants arranged on the windowsill, the good coffee machine on the kitchen bench. She looked, in the photo she sent of herself standing in the doorway, like someone who had walked through something difficult and come out standing. I rang her that evening, and she asked how the new veggie patch was coming along. I said the tomatoes were in. She laughed and said, I was exactly the same as I'd always been. And she said it like it was a good thing. And I suppose it was. Diane and I don't have a relationship now. That's not said with bitterness. It's just the geography of how things settled. We exchanged a few polite emails through the settlement process, and that's been the extent of it. I wish her no harm. I don't particularly wish her well. I'm simply indifferent, which is perhaps the most honest outcome you can arrive at with someone who was once the center of your life. Marcus, I haven't seen since the settlement. I have nothing to say to him. I don't imagine I ever will. What I'll say here, for anyone who might be sitting somewhere listening to this story and recognizing something in it, some version of that cold Tuesday feeling, that kitchen quiet, that sense that the floor of your life has shifted without warning, is this: you are allowed to take your time. The most important decisions I made in those months were made slowly, carefully, with good counsel and clear eyes. The impulse to act immediately, to confront and accuse and burn everything down at once, that impulse is understandable. I felt it. But it rarely serves you as well as patience does. Document everything. Understand your financial position before emotions run the conversation. Find people you trust, not to tell you what you want to hear, but to help you think clearly. And know this: the person who betrayed you has already decided who they are. The only decision left to you is who you're going to be. At 64, I'm in better shape than I expected. I grow tomatoes and zucchini. I have a dog who thinks he's a puppy. I have a daughter I talk to properly now, which is something I wouldn't trade for anything. I have Wednesday evenings in a community center with a group of blokes who've all walked through something. And I have, on the good mornings, and there are more of them than I expected, the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who knows exactly where he stands. That's enough. More than enough, actually. It's more than I had before. And I know that now. Even if it took losing everything I thought I had to understand it. The betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just the place where my real one finally started. If this story moved you in any way, I'd ask you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've been through something similar, leave a comment below, because none of us should have to walk these roads alone. You said, Durdavau Nori Dung, Darviet, and Funtik, Prompt 1, Tartiu da, Thumbnail, Mota de Andu Swat, Tiêu de Gok. I caught my wife with my son-in-law.